All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a completely massive geopolitical shift happening right now. Behind closed doors, away from all the typical political noise, the United States and China are making high-stakes decisions that are directly altering the fate of the Middle East, and specifically, putting a huge squeeze on Iran. If you really want to understand how global power is shifting in real time, this is exactly where we need to start.
We're going to break this down into 5 quick parts: the superpower summit, finding common ground, squeezing Iran's leverage, the surveillance state reality, and finally, a new geopolitical map.
Okay, starting with part 1, the superpower summit, and where the money actually resides.
We're basically watching a giant domino effect here, and to really get what's happening at the top of the global food chain, we have to talk about the sheer economics driving it all. Think about the number 200. This summit in Beijing didn't just bring politicians into a room, it brought the heavy hitters. We are talking about American industry titans, billionaires like Elon Musk and Tim Cook, sitting right across the table from Chinese leadership. They're negotiating massive trade agreements, including a monumental deal for 200 Boeing jets. The big takeaway here? Public diplomacy is one thing, but true global leverage is found exactly where the big money moves.
Moving on to part 2, finding common ground and what I call the competitor dynamic. Now, you might be wondering how these two superpowers find any common ground at all, given their obvious ideological differences. Well, it's not a Cold War ideology anymore. As this quote lays out perfectly, they're competing within the exact same international system. They aren't outright enemies on a battlefield. Think of them more like massive corporate rivals, like Apple and Google. They might try to undercut each other, sure, but at the end of the day, they both absolutely need the system itself to survive and function. And that shared system is exactly what forces them to cooperate. Believe it or not, impartially reporting on the summit shows the US and China actually found direct common ground on 2 incredibly crucial goals for the Middle East. Number 1, the Strait of Hormuz has to stay open for global trade, period. And number 2, Iran absolutely cannot get nuclear weapons. Why? Because the global economy was literally melting down over the crisis in the Strait. If shipping stops, Chinese exports drop off a cliff.
So, this shared economic panic led to a really fascinating moment. President Xi actually looked at the US and offered to help with the Iran situation, saying, if I could be of any help whatsoever, I would like to help. I mean, wow. And why does China's help matter so much? Because they are the world's largest importer of Iranian crude oil. Iran's military and nuclear funding rely heavily on those exact exports. So when the biggest customer in the room offers to help the US stabilize things, that is a tectonic shift in leverage. Which leads us perfectly into part 3, squeezing Iran's leverage, where rhetoric finally meets reality.
We are seeing this massive squeeze on Iran, and there is a huge, glaring gap between their public story and the reality on the ground. Publicly, Iran's foreign minister is projecting total dominance, acting like major nations need to come beg in Tehran just to get their ships through the Gulf safely. But the actual geopolitical reality? It's completely different. According to figures cited by President Trump, Iran's 15-ship navy is essentially decimated. The big superpowers aren't pleading for safe passage, they're just bypassing Iran's demands entirely.
And if you want a perfect example of what losing leverage looks like, just look at this staggering number, 2 million. Right when these meetings were happening, tracking data caught a Chinese supertanker carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil sailing straight through the Strait of Hormuz. But here's the catch. It was Iraqi crude oil. China completely bypassed Iranian oil and shipped someone else's product right out of Iran's front door. That is just wild.
And the rest of the neighborhood is definitely taking notes. Regional powers are straight up refusing to bow to the rhetoric anymore. You've got Saudi Arabia conducting military airstrikes, the UAE joining Operation Epic Fury, and China pivoting its economic weight over to Iraqi oil. Basically, the US and China agreeing to keep the strait open served as a giant green light for neighboring nations to dismantle Iran's traditional stronghold. Now, let's zoom out a bit for part 4, the surveillance state reality and the private friction happening behind the scenes. Because we really have to look past the handshakes. The pomp and circumstance of public diplomacy almost always hides a highly controlled private reality. While these billionaires are striking deals, Beijing is locked down. Reporters on the ground noted that any time a foreign TV broadcast even mentioned human rights or literally anything deemed negative about China, the screen would abruptly cut to color bars. A message would pop up saying, "Please stand by," for about 30 seconds, just a constant, stark reminder that what is public is one thing and what is privately controlled is entirely different. So it's this incredibly delicate balancing act. Picture a clean 50-50 split. On one hand, you have fantastic trade talks, mutual respect, and shared goals for the Middle East. But on the other hand, you're in an environment saturated with thousands of street cameras. You've got intense military security filtering out massive airport crowds, and this constant underlying anxiety about cyber threats to U.S. infrastructure. It's a heavy blanket of economic cooperation draped right over a bed of intense suspicion.
And honestly, their actual priorities behind those closed doors aren't perfectly aligned either. The U.S. was laser-focused on resolving the Iranian crisis and securing those trade routes, but state-run Chinese agencies made it crystal clear to their own people that Taiwan is still their #1 issue. They even threw in a veiled threat that mishandling Taiwan could lead to real clashes. So yeah, they agree on the Middle East, but those other geopolitical fault lines, they're still very, very active. So, knowing that the U.S. and China are completely locked in on their Middle Eastern economic goals, despite all that friction, we have to ask the big narrative question: where does this actually leave Iran? If the two heaviest hitters on the planet agree the game needs to change, how much of a say does the target really have?
Which brings us to our final section, a new geopolitical map. Because at the end of the day, the negotiations that actually stick are the ones backed by real money and superpower influence. And things are moving incredibly fast right now. What started with global billionaires in Beijing rapidly turned into a rock-solid consensus to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. But the diplomacy didn't stop there. It's accelerating. It all culminated with President Trump extending a formal invitation for President Xi to visit the White House on September 24th. They are actively choosing economic stability over constant adversarial friction, cementing a totally new dynamic.
So I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. We are watching the geopolitical map being rewritten in real time, not by endless, low-level summits, but by aligning the pure, undeniable economic interests of the world's two largest powers. As the US and China keep rewriting the rules of global diplomacy based on shared commerce, how will this pragmatic shift permanently alter the balance of power in the Middle East? Keep an eye on the actual money, guys, because that's where the real story is unfolding. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and keep questioning the narrative.